Welcome to the Tech Ed Podcast, where we visit with leaders who are shaping, innovating, and disrupting technical education. People who are not afraid to think differently, not afraid to try something new, all with the goal of securing the American dream for the next generation of STEM and workforce talent. Welcome into the Tech Ed Podcast. It is your host, Matt Kirkner. Today we have somebody that is doing some great things in manufacturing, great things around culture. We talk a lot on the podcast about how we create the right culture in an organization, how we keep everybody pulling in a direction and excited about the work that we're doing. We have somebody who's a huge advocate and a huge evangelist for company culture as well. He comes to us in the form of John Mellowes, and John is the Chief Executive Officer of a company that a lot of people are familiar with, maybe not everybody, but a huge manufacturing company called Charter Manufacturing. And John, it's really a pleasure to have you here in the hallowed halls of the Tech Ed Podcast. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for having me.
For our listeners who may not be completely familiar with what you do, tell us a little bit about Charter.
Charter Manufacturing is a fourth generation family-owned business. We have 11 facilities in 6 states, primarily in the Midwest, 2,300 employees. Not only are we the fourth generation, we also have 4 businesses. One business, Charter Wire, produces shaped wire products, including some products, some automotive engine products. We also have 2 gray and ductile iron foundries. But our largest business is a business called Charter Steel. Charter Steel is a 1 million ton a year steel maker. We take scrap metal. We'll melt the scrap metal down. We'll refine the chemistry, cast, and roll the product into a steel product called wire rod. And if you're not familiar with wire rod, it's really a coil of steel wire. It may look like the kid's toy Slinky, if you remember that. But imagine this Slinky is 42 inches high, 42 inches round. The wire may be a quarter of an inch all the way up to 1.5 inches.
So just that would not walk downstairs alone or in pairs, right? That's a little bit bigger than the typical Slinky.
Because that coil weighs 5,000 pounds each, right? So, and we're typically selling wire rod to parts manufacturers, primarily in the cold heading, cold forming, cold forging industry. But you'll see our steel in a lot of fasteners, nuts, bolts, screws. Primarily in automotive as well. So if you open up the hood of your car or crawl underneath and you see the nuts and bolts in it, we didn't make those parts, but we made the steel that goes into those parts.
It's absolutely incredible. You think about all of the different products that steel goes into, and it's really, the world doesn't revolve unless you've got manufacturers like yourself creating these raw materials that other manufacturers are forming into something. So again, it's a product that everybody uses, whether it's coming from you or somewhere else, every single day, whether they're driving their vehicle, whether they're nailing a picture on the wall, whatever it is. I mean, that's all your type of technology and your type of product. And I just marvel at all of these small to mid-sized companies, or in your case, a fairly substantial company, 6 states, and producing, you said 5 million tons of steel a year. Is that right?
1 million tons.
1 million tons of steel a year.
I wish we were producing 5 million tons.
Exactly. Well, there's something to aspire to, right? Maybe in another 4 generations, right? But just an incredible story. You mentioned 6 states. I know Wisconsin, Illinois, and Ohio. What are the other 3?
Yeah, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Texas.
Yeah, so just some great U.S. manufacturing behemoth states, and right at the core of all that. Really exciting. You also mentioned the fact that you're not only 4th generation, but you're a family-owned company. Tell us a little bit about being a private company. And a lot of times the big brands that we hear about, those are companies with thousands of shareholders that are traded on these big exchanges. You're a really significant company, but privately owned. Tell us about private ownership, the benefits both to you in terms of leading the company and to your employees working for a company that's private.
Family-owned businesses, certainly a unique corporate structure in the corporate landscape. In my career, I actually have worked for a different family's business. I've worked for a partnership. I've worked as a consultant to publicly traded companies, and I've worked for a company that was owned by private equity. So I've seen a number of different ownership structures. Private companies, I think, are unique, and each of them have their pluses and their minuses, I'm sure. But 2 positives that really strike me about family-owned private companies are, one, patient capital. So typically, especially if the family's in, after its first generation. They've been around for a while, and they hopefully intend to be around for a while longer. Right. And short-term results are really important, but perhaps they're not the end all be all. And you always want to, when you're in that state, you're always looking for the long term. And we talk about the long term at Charter all the time. I think another positive aspect of a privately held family business is the connection that ownership has with the different stakeholders of the company, whether it's employees, customers, vendors, or other stakeholders. Because there's a name, there's a face. Ownership is present, and those relationships can be made. Between patient capital, which really leads to stability in the company, and having a connection with the ownership, I think those things become foundation blocks to culture, which helps to influence the engagement of everybody involved.
Absolutely. And we're going to go deep into culture in just a little bit. But I think to that point, when you think about I've run private equity backed businesses. I too have been involved in publicly traded and large publicly traded companies. There are benefits, certainly, but you don't necessarily have that long game if you're always worried about what the market is going to do to your share price, or you're always worried about when a private equity partner wants to exit a business. It just creates a different paradigm that can have an impact on culture, not necessarily adverse, but it's one thing to look forward 50 years and say, this is what our company's going to be for 50 years. It's another thing to look forward 50 months and say, this is where we need to be in 50 months. It changes your thinking. Is that fair to say? Yeah. So you've been family owned business. You're a fourth generation organization, fourth generation leader of the company in the manufacturing space. What do you love about the manufacturing space? And is there anything that might surprise our listeners about manufacturing, something they weren't aware of?
One of the things I love about manufacturing is you're always trying to get better. Continuous improvement is one of our core values at Charter. We're always trying to get better. If you're not, you're falling behind to inflation. You're falling behind the competition. And because it's a value at Charter, we invest in it all the time. We invest in teams. We give them the tools to try to come up with solutions of problems that exist in the business. And so for me, what's so exciting to see is these teams come together, solve problems, figure out new ways to maybe do something that we've been doing the same way, and then to be able to see the results that come from it, and then celebrate with the team. I think those things are really, really neat about manufacturing in general. And as a manufacturer, if you're not continuously improving, especially today with higher inflation, you're probably falling behind. Another thing I really like about manufacturing and being in a family business, we've been around for a few generations. We have a number of employees who have been around for a few generations, and to watch those employees have careers at Charter is pretty exciting. To see the different stages of career, even to celebrate retirements, or occasionally they'll bring some of their family members into the business as well. And you start to see that cycle of a career, start over, which is, for me as an owner in a family business, that's pretty rewarding as well.
Absolutely. There's no greater compliment to a leader than to have somebody bring their loved ones into the organization and say, I spent a career at this company. I want my son or daughter, my niece or nephew, my neighbor's kid to come work in this business as well. The other thing that I think, you may not think of it as surprising. I think that some people are surprised by how continuous improvement drives manufacturing. And, you think about working in a manufacturing environment, in my years of running manufacturers and serving the big three at that time as a tier one automotive supplier, they were expecting 2-3% cost downs every year. In other words, they wanted, some people live in a world where you increase your price 2 to 3% every year. That was a world where you decrease your price 2 to 3% every year to your customer. And the only way to do that is through continuous improvement, driving waste out of process, finding bottlenecks, finding more efficient ways to engage with your customer, finding ways to maybe give them more margin in their business without necessarily just reducing the price in yours. And that really is a super dynamic thing. Manufacturing, you don't sit still. You're always figuring out how to get better. I mentioned, and I was in a CEO group with one of your group presidents a generation ago, probably 25 years ago, and he would talk all the time about continuous improvement, and his line was always continuous improvement drives our business. So it's fascinating to hear now, literally a generation, 25 years later, that is still such a core part of your organization and still such a core part of your core values. So continuous improvement is a core value. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, Thanks for sharing that story. Maybe not going back 25 years, but 20 years ago, we actually started a formal CI program at Charter. And every year now, dozens of employees go through formalized training. And one aspect of the training is everyone gets a CI project to work on. And that, along with other CI projects that are going on in the company, we have a methodology where we capture what the benefit of those projects are. And we take just 1 year's worth of benefit. And in our showcase day, we have a CI showcase day every single year where we celebrate CI. We talk about the cumulative annualized benefits from our CI program. And it is on the order of magnitude of our operating income as a company. And, I do remind the audience when I talk about it that maybe not all those improvements that occurred 20 years ago are with us today, but I'm pretty sure CI also occurs outside of formal CI programs. And the point is, CI is extremely important to our manufacturing company and, quite frankly, manufacturing in general to stay competitive, to stay ahead of competition and inflation.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's just a necessary part of doing business in manufacturing. And the truth of the matter is that if you're not improving your process, if you're not driving out cost, if you're not improving yield, if you're not finding ways to produce more with, I hate the term do more with less, but to do more with the same group of people that you have, you're going to fall behind. And the only way that a company can survive and thrive for 4 generations is by continuing to improve itself and to continue to make things better. That's an important part of your core values. You and I share this belief that mission and core values are really, really important, that's where you start in a business, right? And you should be taking every single one of your decisions back to those core values. At the Tech Ed podcast and several of our other organizations, we say we're securing the American dream for the next generation. That's our mission. That's a pretty big mission, but every decision we make comes back to that. So talk to me about, your mission, your core values, and why establishing that and living that is so important to you.
I think a mission statement and core values are really important foundation blocks for a company's culture. Mm-hmm. And then the company's culture, I think, is a really important foundation block for the company itself and the success that it has. Other foundation blocks would be, the products, the technologies that you use. Culture is extremely important foundation block because, in my mind, it helps to drive engagement. And you can have the greatest strategies in the world, you can have the greatest products in the world, but if you don't have a engaged workforce helping you, launch those products, build those products, you're not going to be successful in the long term. And so culture and how it drives engagement, I believe, is just such a critical part of a business, fueled by mission, values, but also fueled by, how things get done in the business, beliefs in the business, what the norms are to get things done in the business, how people treat each other, what behaviors are rewarded, what behaviors aren't tolerated. All of those things, really come out in the company's culture.
Absolutely. There's so many things you're saying that I'm a huge believer in. I put in different ways. Sometimes, one of my favorite mantras that I think our team probably gets tired of hearing is that leaders get the behaviors they exhibit, expect, and tolerate, right? Which is, it's not part of our core values per se in the organization, but as a leader of an organization, if you're going to expect people to do it, you better be willing to set that example for them. And if you're going to set expectations for people, they need to be clear expectations, or it's not fair to somebody to say, oh, you didn't hit the target when you never told them what the target was, right? And then the other part of it is, when we are missing or when we do need to make sure that we've got accountability and people are committing to things, making sure that they're held to those expectations. It doesn't mean that somebody necessarily, gets walked out the door if they miss, but it's more about just making sure that people know that if we're an organization that's going to build ourselves around commitments and build ourselves around keeping those commitments, that's a key part of a successful organization. The other thing that you mentioned, John, is the idea that culture is a foundational block or a building block along with products, along with technology. So much of that is married to each other, right? So it's really almost like a cycle where all three of those have to support each other. Yeah. Is that right?
Yep.
So let's now talk about your culture specifically. You touched on some things, how things get done. You talked about continuous improvement. How would you describe the culture at Charter Manufacturing?
Yeah, it starts with our values: teamwork, continuous improvement, safety, and trust. And trust, we have a specific definition around trust, around building skill, being dependable, having connections in the organization, and being very believable. And that's kind of the start of our culture. But I would throw on top of that, just we have a very engaged workforce, a workforce that really wants to help each other out. And we're also a very transparent organization, sharing a lot of information with all of our employees about how the company is doing, both good and bad. And it really creates sort of a bit of a family feel.
Absolutely. I think I mentioned to you in a separate meeting that a few years ago I went through and I looked at all the companies that were nominated as top 100 workplaces in my particular area in Southeast Wisconsin, and it all came back to three things. It was people wanting to work around people that you enjoy being around, that treat each other well. It's almost less who your quote boss is. It's more about who are your friends at work, right? Who are these people you spend every day with? And then respect is the second one, and a huge part of respect is the idea that we're going to share tons of information. We're going to be transparent. We're going to, there's some topics in a business by their nature have to be held in confidence. But for those things that we can share openly, we do that so everybody knows where they stand. And then they're a part of that continuous improvement. And then the other part is freedom and autonomy, which I want to get into in a little bit. But before we kind of dive down that topic, you had mentioned to me that this concept that I just found fascinating called the success formula. And I know our audience is going to love hearing about that. So why don't you talk a little bit about the success formula?
The success formula is something that we talk about regularly at Charter. In its simplest form, it describes the relationship between culture, engagement, performance, and results. And the relationships between these four things, I truly believe, exist in any organization out there. And I'll give you a quick example. Imagine you're in a high school class. And, the culture of that class is defined by the topic, how many kids are in the class, what kind of classroom is, maybe what the desks are like, who the teacher is, how they teach. And all of those things drive how engaged you are in the class, right? How engaged you are in that class affects whether or not you do your reading, whether you do your homework. If you have a question, are you going to raise your hand in class to have your question answered? If your question doesn't get answered, are you going to stick around after class to ask the teacher? If you're really engaged and you really want to know, you probably will. Sure. Your performance on homework and class participation, et cetera, over time will translate into how you do on the test, right? And those are the results. And the results, they impact culture in many ways. In this example, it might be if you do really well in the class, maybe the next semester you're in an honors section. So that would be just an example of how these four things interrelate. I truly believe that, again, in any organization, these relationships exist. At Charter, I think the connections are very positive and positively reinforcing. So much so, I believe that this is a competitive advantage for us. At Charter, we have a great culture, and it helps to drive employee engagement. Engaged employees don't just do their job, but they look for ways to improve the performance of the company. Performance over time leads to results. And as a company, we reinvest results back in the business in many different ways. And this has a positive effect on culture. And so to me, this is a positively reinforcing feedback loop. And as I said, is I believe, a driver of our competitive advantage in the markets that we play in.
Years ago, I had a mentor. This goes back 30 years ago. And I had a mentor in that business. I was young, I was green. I think I was chief operating officer of the company. I was, maybe 5-7 years out of my education pathway and was involved on this leadership team. And I talked about profitability all the time and how we need to make the team profitable or need to make the company profitable and the important. And finally, he walked into my office one day. He's like, just stop talking about that. He's like, profitability is a result. He's like, if you do the right things in the organization, that will be a result. But most of the people don't want, they don't want to hear about that. Yeah, they want to work for a successful business. But how do we focus on those things that drive and create profitability? And that sounds like exactly the thing you're talking about is how do we think about culture and engagement and performance? And if we do those things right, the results are gonna, and they don't always take care of themselves, but they're eventually you're gonna get to the right results. I've just never forgotten that lesson.
Yeah, and our organization will regularly talk about how results, they get reinvested back in the business. whether that's in new equipment to grow the business. Growth in the business leads to opportunity for people, maybe new jobs to take on more responsibility, which leads to higher wages, et cetera. We often invest in people in terms of training, again, very beneficial to the culture and to the employees. And also we reinvest directly, whether it's profit sharing or gain sharing. So yes, we do talk about that part of the success formula, but we talk about others as well. We regularly do an engagement survey at our company so we can understand what are the areas that we can work on. We already mentioned our continuous improvement program. So those are the tools that engage employees leverage to drive performance. And we already mentioned the results that have come from that program. So again, it's just part of the language at Charter and, has fueled our success for a little bit.
That's interesting that you're surveying employee engagement. So what are some of the tools that you use to create that engagement, and how do you measure it? I'd be curious about learning a little bit more about that side of it, and then any other secrets or maybe not so secret ideas you can share with us about how you create a really highly engaged team of people.
We leverage a third-party provider to administer the survey. It's a pretty lengthy survey, but we get feedback on how we're doing on safety, how we're doing leadership, how we're doing in communication. Very, very thorough survey. We get 80% of our employees participate in it, which is good. And the third party provider, comes up with an engagement score, which is important, but it's really, from my standpoint, it identifies opportunities for us to get better, which are really exciting. Specifically, as far as drivers of engagement, my belief is that engagement comes from satisfying some basic needs for employees. And that first need is about having psychological safety at work. And psychological safety comes from many different sources. But when a person feels safe at work, their brain gets freed up. Their brain gets freed up to be able to be as productive, as creative as they can be, which is the state that we want all of our employees to be in. We want them to be at their best each and every day. And so psychological safety is sort of the baseline. If someone doesn't feel safe, whether it's because of a bad culture or because maybe the company's in financial troubles and they're worried about their job, neuroscience tells us that their brain will not allow them to be as productive or as creative as they could because they're preoccupied on some of those other challenges that might be out there. After psychological safety, being part of a team is a big driver of engagement. Certainly Daniel Pink talks about this in terms of having a purpose, but also Simon Sinek talks about it with regards to wanting to be part of a team and some of the safety aspects that come with that. Even myself, who's an introvert, we want the social interactions. We want to be part of a social group to achieve goals together. After you have being a part of a team or can sense that collective purpose of being a part of a team, people want to be recognized for the role that they do on the team. Nothing feels better that when you've done your job well, when your supervisor in front of others tells you, what a great job that you're doing. And so it's a huge driver for engagement. And then the final driver of engagement, and really this one is, if you're doing the first three, then you're able to drive a lot of engagement from development and developing towards your own personal potential. And so those are the four, in my mind, four drivers of engagement: psychological safety, being part of a team, being recognized as a contributor to a team, and then, developing your career to get to whatever your personal potential is.
Absolutely. I mean, and who among us wouldn't want to be part of an organization that was doing all four of those things, right? And I love the whole idea of the psychological safety and feeling as though, your job isn't always at risk, right? If I'm coming into work every day and I'm a little bit worried that my job or my promotion or my position in the organization is going to be, at risk if I share my ideas, if I tell people what I think, if I suggest a continuous improvement idea, I'm going to shut down. I'm going to quit sharing those types of things. And in an organization where people feel safe and they feel like they can express themselves, and that, we tell our people in some of our businesses, we can't implement every great idea, right? I mean, our goal is to have more great ideas than we have resources to implement them, because that means we're leaving no stone unturned. But if people know that they're listened to and people know that their ideas are going to be acted upon, or at least considered really, really an important part of creating an amazing team. And obviously, who wouldn't want to work in an organization like that? I want to dive a little bit deeper into the Daniel Pink topic that you mentioned. And we teed up a little bit earlier that, in some of my work, we've realized that, people love their job when they're working with people they like, when they're working in an organization where they feel their opinions are respected and they have information that's being shared with them. And then the third thing is what I call freedom or independence, and what Daniel Pink might call autonomy. Talk about autonomy. Why is that so important in an organization, and how do you promote it at Charter Manufacturing?
Yeah. So, right, Daniel Pink in his book Drive talks about motivation. The true drivers of motivation are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And in my mind, autonomy is really important. And it gets back to the drivers of engagement that I just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
People want to be a part of a team, but they also want to be a contributor in that team. They want to be able to look at their other teammates and say, yeah, I belong here. And, having that autonomy to be able to do your job without help, or to be able to do your job in your way, I think is a huge motivator for employees. So you back it up. So how do you create that? Again, it starts with, the right situational leadership by the supervisor in developing that person so that they are able to do that job with little to no, supervision.
Absolutely. We kind of talk about the idea that, there's certain jobs that lend themselves more to autonomy or independence than others, but within whatever that responsibility is, giving people the maximum amount of autonomy, especially if they're great people and they're self-motivated and they want to be part of a team that's accomplishing things. It's amazing how just unleashing that and letting people go in their direction creates unbelievable results.
Yeah,
and it sounds like you've seen the same thing.
Gives them some personal freedom. It also gives them, tremendous sense of pride about the job that they're doing.
Absolutely. No, we've talked about leadership, talked about leading, fourth generation organization. That's got to bring an element of, kind of stewardship as well. You and I talked about that. So contrast and compare the idea of leadership and stewardship for us.
Yeah. So for me, stewardship is very similar to leadership, but I think it emphasizes an element of time. And you are leading, or you are a steward of an organization for a period of time, with the idea that at some point that time will end, and that you're going to be passing over those responsibilities to the next leader / steward. So stewardship really just brings, in my mind, the element of time, and that there's something coming next, and you want to leave it in a better place than you found it. And certainly when you're thinking about a family business, and a family business that hopes to go on for many more generations in the future, as a leader in the business, you want to be a good steward of the business, because or you hope that this business is going to be around for many generations to come.
Absolutely. A couple of years ago, I was actually in a small group, maybe 30, 35 people, and there was a Fortune 500 company CEO that almost all of our listeners would recognize the company, but it was a private setting, so I won't refer to the company. But that gentleman was running a huge public company, and somebody said, "What keeps you awake at night?" And he said, "The whole stewardship idea is what keeps me awake at night." He's like, people say, "What are you doing with your company?" or "What's the future for your company?" He's like, "This is not my company." He's like, it's owned by somebody else. I just have the privilege of being the leader of this organization. And he said his biggest role in that job was stewardship. I just thought that was a really, really interesting way to look at the job of a leader. You think about this whole idea of being a steward, of having this incredible legacy that spanned generations of your family, building this amazing company. Technology sure changed over the course of that period of time, right? I mean, I've lived through, probably now 30 years of manufacturing technology, and I think about how it's changed over the course of 30 years. You think about an organization that's going on a century, right? That's a long, long time. Lots of technologies changed in 87 years. As this continues to accelerate, the change that we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years, incredible. I think the change that we see in the next 10 years is going to be even more fascinating in the manufacturing space if we do it right in a really, really good way. But, you and I both have this fascination with the power of data and how we run an organization. And now we've got huge data sets. We have artificial intelligence, we have machine learning, and so on. Talk a little bit about your philosophies on how we harness all of this data that we're gathering for continuous improvement to drive that core value for your organization.
As we talked about, CI, so important to the organization. Data is the feedstock for those processes. So over time, we've invested quite a bit in different ways to gather data and use data. Some simple examples of where CI has leveraged large pieces of data in our organization. A simple one would be process data on a production line. And you do an analysis focusing around the process data, around the bottleneck on that production line. And you leverage the data to try to figure out different ways to expand throughput, improve efficiency through the bottleneck. Simple example, maybe even a simpler example, but it deals with a lot more data. Vibration analysis on pieces of equipment. This is well documented in industry today. A lot of people using vibration analysis to understand the condition of their equipment, when they need to elevate the preventative maintenance and maybe replace some critical parts. One area of the business or story that I would like to share of how we leverage data from a preventative maintenance standpoint. In our steel mills, we have two 100-ton furnaces. These furnaces are steel shelled vessels that have a refractory lining. And in the vessel, we hold, 100 tons or so of molten metal. Well, that refractory lining has a use life, and you have to replace it over time. And it's very expensive to shut our facility down. We run 24/7, shut our facility down to do a furnace reline. And we have leveraged data, specifically multiple thermocouples within the shell of the furnace, collecting data very regularly. And we understand what the profile of temperatures looks like across those thermocouples, across the shell of the furnace over the refractory lining's use life. And we can, we have predictive models now that help us plan when we'll shut the furnace down. And we do it now right about every 2 months. We're regularly monitoring the data. Sometimes that lining may be wearing a little faster. We may pull it up, the reline up. Sometimes the lining might seem to be lasting longer, so we'll push that reline out. But it's just an example of how you're using just a tremendous amount of data to help you just make better decisions on a daily basis. And we'll also leverage that data. Occasionally, we'll run experiments on how to continuously improve our refractory lining and what operating conditions can we change to extend the use life of that lining. Just one very simple example of how, as a company, we're leveraging large data sets to continuously improve.
Well, it may seem like a simple example, but that is a really, really complex calculation that you're doing there. And kind of put that into perspective, if I'm understanding it right, if you're replacing refractory lining more often than you need to, number one, you're going to have more downtime. Number two, you probably have more refractory material costs that you're investing in. So you have that cost that goes along with it. And then the other challenge is if you let it go too long, now your utilities are probably, your bills are probably going up because you're using more energy to create the heat that you need to be able to run the process. You run the risk of maybe some quality issues because the system isn't running the way that it's supposed to. And so by optimizing this combination of not doing it too soon, but not doing it too late, through the use of data, creating those huge data sets, you have all these other benefits that accrue to the business that drive continuous improvement. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, pretty close, except if you leave the refractory layer on too long, it will wear to the point where you'll melt a hole in the furnace and have a catastrophic failure. So even a worse outcome.
Absolutely.
And that's never a good day for anybody. So it's something that we absolutely want to avoid, and absolutely will invest in the data, invest in the technology to prevent that from happening. But really also having an eye towards continuous improvement and trying to extend that use life as long as we can, but to do it safely, of course.
Absolutely. And it's just a fantastic example. You talk about thermocouples, other sensors that you're putting on this manufacturing equipment, gathering data, smart technology that's able to make its own decisions and communicate with other sensors and devices, send that information up to a computer network, to a data collector, and eventually to the cloud. And, as we move into that, all this data that you're able to draw, you're really moving into a point where maybe you're employing artificial intelligence even more actively to figure out all of the patterns that maybe we just using, human-based mathematical models wouldn't be able to grab, but we can grab them if we're doing it using AI software and AI platforms. Is that where some of this is going? And do you think AI is going to revolutionize manufacturing, or is it just another continuous improvement tool, or is it both?
Certainly artificial intelligence and, maybe even more specifically machine learning, but artificial intelligence is broader than just machine learning, coupled with other pillars of Industry 4.0, whether that's the sensor technology that you just talked about, ways to gather the data, being able to store large amounts of data, and of course, enhance computing power to churn through all that data. You put that all together, absolutely will accelerate change and continuous improvement in manufacturing. Is that a revolution? I don't know, but it's absolutely going to speed the pace of change up quite a bit in our space. And as a company, we're trying to figure out all the different ways that we can leverage some of these newer technologies to fuel our culture of continuous improvement.
So we've talked all about these incredible advancements in artificial intelligence, the ability to use data in terms of making great manufacturing decisions, predictive analytics, vibration analysis. We've got all of this information, all of these tools that we can use to advance our manufacturing processes, advance continuous improvement, continue to live that important part of your culture. One of the challenges I think that goes along with that, John, is how do we make sure we're bringing our employees along on the journey, right? I mean, we know that engagement part of it is so important. And as these technologies advance at an ever increasing rate of speed, making sure that the folks that are, doing the important work in our organizations are, conversant and up to speed on these applications, aren't intimidated by them, aren't scared by them. To your point, kind of protecting that psychological security in the organization. How do you go about doing that? How do you prepare them for these technologies? How do you train them for the jobs of the future?
Our view of technology at Charter is that it's there to help the company, help employees do their jobs better. And so communication and change management, when you have technologies, whether it's automation out on the shop floor or maybe generative AI, for example, in some other parts of the company, communicating about those technologies, talking about how they can make jobs easier, how they can allow employees to focus in on one aspect of their job that's perhaps more value add to the company. And so I just think that communication, that change management aspect, to make sure that everybody's on the same page, viewing that technology, that opportunity in the same way, and sharing how it's beneficial to everybody involved.
Absolutely. We had Peter Anderson, who at the time, he's moved on to a different role, at the time was the vice president of manufacturing and supply chain at Cummins, on the podcast a while back. And he was telling this story about how they had automated the workspace of an individual's particular role. It was somebody working on the production side of their business. And he was walking through the plant floor, and this is a woman who, I think as he tells the story, is late 50s, early 60s-ish. And she says, pulls him aside, "Can I talk to you about this robot that you put in my work cell?" And he said, "Sure." She said, I was ready to retire. She's like, "I love my job here at Cummins. I've been doing this for a long time. I love coming to work. I love the people that I work with. But I'll be honest with you, I was getting tired, and it was getting harder and harder to get through the day because in her particular role, lots of lifting, lots of physical labor." She's like, "You put this lift assist robot in my work cell, and this has extended my career for another 5 years at least. And I get to continue to work in this place that I've worked all these years because of that technology." That to me is such a heartwarming story about, to your point, the technology should be deployed to make an individual's job easier, make them more productive, help them add more value, give them a more rewarding role. We talk a lot in manufacturing that as manufacturing technology continues to automate, the closer that a job gets to the automation, the better it pays, the more interesting it often is, the safer it often is. Who doesn't want a better paying, safer, more interesting job? So there's so many ways that these technologies that we're talking about today are improving not just manufacturing and productivity, but improving the lives of workers as well, which I think is that's the whole story, maybe the untold story about manufacturing. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've had similar experiences at Charter with regards to automation out on the shop floor or robotic process automation in the office. Employees are a little wary at first, but if you do a good job of communicating the why and the what and how it's going to, transform their job a little bit, but in a good way,
right?
And maybe take some of the less desirable aspects of their job away and allow them to focus in on the more exciting, the higher value add parts of their job. Then they see the benefits and really embrace it.
Absolutely. And to put some of these pieces together that we've been talking about here on the Tech Ed podcast, when we're focusing on continuous improvement, when we're focusing on psychological security, when people are worried about maybe the future of manufacturing or the future of their job, and we can show them that, look, the way that we make sure that we give all of us the most job security is to make sure that we are as competitive as possible, that we are positioning ourselves in the best possible place in the marketplace. In doing that, whether it's robotic process automation in the office or whether it's a process automation project on the manufacturing floor, that's how we drive continuous improvement. It's a huge tool. So the companies that are deploying that technology, in my mind, are creating opportunities and are creating job security for their teams, not putting them at risk. And I think when we think about it that way, and when employees and team members think about it that way, it provides a great deal of, I think, comfort as we continue to call on them to help us make our processes more and more productive. And that's just kind of bringing that whole idea together of employee engagement, of the culture related to continuous improvement, of driving technology, all the things that are alive and well at Charter. So really appreciate you sharing those thoughts with us. I have one more thought that I'm going to ask you about, and it's a question we ask a lot of our guests here on the Tech Ed podcast. Get some really, really curious and fascinating answers, and I'm sure yours will be no different. If you were to go back several years, maybe several decades, to that 15-year-old John Mellowes, and you could give that individual one piece of advice, what would that piece of advice be?
When I was about 30 years old, I read the book, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, and actually went on and took the class.
Did you?
The course associated with it, which also had a heavy dose of public speaking. And as I mentioned before today, I'm an introvert, and that book and course and experience was very influential to me and understanding a little bit more about who I am, but improving some areas that I needed to work on.
Sure.
And I wish I had done that 15 years prior when I was 15 years old, because I just thought it was, such a valuable experience to me, to the point I've got a ninth and an eighth grader at home, and that book is on their bookshelves.
It's just amazing to me how every single one of those points and every single one of those pieces of advice or tenets that are in those books are as relevant today, maybe even more so as they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so it's interesting to hear you talking about the way that book changed your life, wishing that you could go back 15 years before and start earlier. Though I gotta believe that as things are rolling out here, you're not too terribly disappointed at where this young 15-year-old introvert ended up taking his career, obviously doing amazing things at Charter Manufacturing. Will continue to do amazing things, and just appreciate, John, you taking some time with us on the Tech Ed podcast to share all the great things you're doing, share your philosophies on company culture, on mission, and on vision, and on leadership. Thanks so much for being with us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tech Ed podcast. If you haven't already, subscribe, leave a review, and if you like this episode, share it with a friend. New episodes launch every Tuesday, so listen in next week.